Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming along. We've got quite a large audience today, so quite a lot of people in the room, but also lots of people online listening in, so welcome to everybody. Just a bit of housekeeping to start off with, just safety briefing. So in the event of emergency, instructions will be issued over the emergency warning and communication system. So just follow instructions, pretty straightforward. To kick off the meeting today, I would like to introduce Phil Wallistack. Phil is a Noongar man and will provide a welcome to country for us today.
That's a nice photo. You are alive. You're very quiet. First of all, thank you so much for acknowledging our customs and our tradition here in Noongar country, especially Whadjuk country here. For me to do a welcome to country, I like to more of, you've probably been welcome to country 100 times already in your life. So we don't need to welcome you anymore. We'll just acknowledge our ancestors, our spirits, that they be here today and guide you and support you with the business that you need to do. So to acknowledge our old people and our ancestors, I say, no, jena nyonga bojara. Nyan mor bojara krobada kober nyonga bojara. Koberin jenang no jena kolin nyonga bojara. Koberin jenang no jena kolin nyonga. No kulak. No kolin mortwa. Double kan jena kolin nyonga bojara wa nyan wang ing bojara. Nyan bojara wang ing karajan nyonga bojara. When you look around, you see the land of the Noongar people. It's a beautiful country where we live. We walk softly on this country and we ask the good spirit look over us, keep us safe here today. Also ask your mob that when you walk on this land, wherever you are on your own, just walk softly and the country will talk to you about the courage and the knowledge of culture and how it can guide you. When you walk softly and you feel the place where you are, it'll let you know where you can and can't go. Sometimes you already feel this. You might go to a place and you feel safe, you feel warm, you feel comfort. That's the spirits letting you know it's a good place to be. Or you might go somewhere and you start feeling uneasy. You start to get that little shiver in your body. That's them telling you don't go there. That's when you're connected to a place, when you're connected to country, and you're connected through the songs and the dances and the history, but also just by walking together with a traditional owner or traditional caretaker, I like to say, because we speak on behalf of the country and we've got that courage and that knowledge from the songs and the dances that we get taught from a young age. So from that young age, a little bit of knowledge and courage and about our culture and about the place where we are is embedded into us as Aboriginal people. So little bit all over our whole life. And it's that education that allows me to stand here today and talk in the language that this country understands. Because when we talk in the language of a local area, it vibrates this ground and we awaken this ground and our ancestors and our spirits to be here and ask them to come here and look over you and keep you safe, keep your spirit safe while you're here. So Dabakan Jina Kuling, Nalak Jina Kuling, Nunga Bojarawa. We walk together, learning from each other about this country. Noongar bojara Whadjuk Borlo bojarawa. Wanji nyan mor bojarawa jala Dabakan jina gola Noongar bojarawa. Marma jinang no jina gola Noongar bojarawa. Marma jinang no jina gola no kola. So thank you so much for acknowledging our customs, our traditions here in Noongar country. And I hope that you'll get home safely. The good spirit look over you and keep you safe so that you can do your business here today. And just communicate against each other and we walk together and we learn from each other. What did you know?
Thank you, Phil. And on behalf of my colleagues on stage here and all of NOPSEMA, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which we live and work and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging and all First Nations people here with us today. So up on stage today is myself, Nicola Brischetto. I'm the Deputy Director in the Office of the Chief Executive at NOPSEMA. Also with me is Cameron Grebe, our Head of Environment, Renewables and Decommissioning, and Catherine Kesteven, who is General Manager of the Offshore Resources Branch of the Department of Industry, Science and Resources. Catherine's here to sit in on the Q&A panel with us a bit later on at the end of the presentation in case there are any questions that relate to policy or legislative change. 4 questions. We won't be taking them from the floor today. We're going to use the Slido app. So there is a QR code. These are spread all around the room. There's also a number that you can put in if you haven't got the QR code after you download the Slido app. So I'll be monitoring those and asking questions to Cam and Catherine at the conclusion of the presentation. The Australian Government recognises Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures as a critical part of our national identity. The government has made a commitment to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full, including a referendum in this term of government to enshrine an Indigenous voice to Parliament in the Constitution. A Maracata Commission will also be co-designed to work on a national process of treaty making and truth-telling. NOPSEMA supports this work. We recognise the important role First Nations peoples have in informing decision-making when those decisions have an effect on them. So I'm now going to hand over to Cam, and Cam's going to talk you through the key points in the guideline.
Thanks, Nicola, and welcome from myself to everyone here, and thank you to Phil. He had a great backdrop, I think, to the discussion today. Unfortunately, my story is a little bit drier than Phil's, but I think is a useful follow-on. We'll be talking through predominantly today about the guideline that we're issuing and will be available after the briefing today. It's coming from a perspective of the existing regulations and, importantly, as you'd all be aware, the appeal decision of the full bench of the Federal Court on the Barossa matter. To start off, and I think you know who the regulator is, but there are a lot of stakeholders involved in this briefing, including up to 700 online. So I think it's important to clarify our capacity here as the regulator and our role. We're the independent regulator established under, obviously, an Act of Parliament as an independent statutory authority to oversee both the offshore petroleum, greenhouse gas storage industries, but also more recently, offshore renewable energy projects under a separate piece of legislation. We also operate under the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act through an endorsed program through the strategic assessment provisions, and therefore have regard to and have to operate under various EPBC provisions. Our role, as is described on the screen there, absolutely has an advice role on good practice and how we interpret the law, and that's predominantly what today is about. But clearly many of you as in companies would normally interact with us through our compliance role, either through the approvals process, through inspections, compliance, and potentially the pointier end of things in terms of addressing non-compliance. Given this role, the important part to bear in mind as we go through today is a clarification, and there's already, I think, several dozen questions come through on Slido before we started regarding the guideline and the basis for issuing it without consultation. And so straight up, I wanted to address that and clarify the purpose of the guideline is merely to clarify and communicate the law as it now stands post the appeal decision. It is a fairly lengthy judgment, but it sets out some very clear, simple and workable pathways to address consultation and compliance with the regulations. But it is set out through a court decision and needs to be read in conjunction with NOPSEMA's other guidance, such as assessment policies, and the guideline serves to bring them together into one spot. There isn't any good practice or prescription, for example, around specific consultation processes by title holders. As you'll see as we go through the briefing today, that's because the court and the regulations clearly make that a responsibility of the title holder, and it is case specific. For that reason, the consultation with those that are involved in the consultation, consultees, I don't know if that's a word in the dictionary, but I'm going to use it. The expectation, as we identify in the guidelines, is that consultation is something that is done by title holders with those that are being consulted to ensure that the processes they employ for consulting as title holders address the expectations of relevant persons. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions to tease that apart when we get towards the end. About the judgment itself, what's really important, and we've been communicating with title holders since the 2nd of December on this point, that the appeal decision clarifies the law. We don't have regard to the primary case that had been previously reflected in our communications, decision-making and guidance. And so we focus on the appeal decision, which was handed down the 2nd of December. I'm sure everyone here has read it and are interested in how we view it, and that's what the briefing's about today. But it obviously provides clarity and details on the work required now by title holders to consult with relevant persons in accordance with the regulations. It obviously also sets out requirements for NOPSEMA and how it makes decisions under the same regulations. What's really important, and there'll be a fair degree of emphasis on this, and we need to bear in mind the point as we get into the nitty-gritty of regulations, which can sound very process-oriented. The takeaway from here is that genuine and more rigorous efforts to consult broadly with all relevant persons, including First Nations people, is clearly set out in the appeal decision. The importance of that decision has meant that we've already been communicating since the 2nd of December with title holders that are affected, with plans either under assessment, either with title holders already to address deficiencies we've identified through the assessment process, or under assessment currently. And we've been communicating to make sure that those environment plans, when they're resubmitted or submitted if they're new after the 2nd of December, embody information and evidence that demonstrates the consultation's been carried out in light of the court's decision. The clear message from government and NOPSEMA is that the decision provides certainty around the requirements and identifies interpretation and approaches that ensure the workability of the regulations. It does require work. It's not without work and effort that's going to be required to comply. And there's an important distinction that we want to keep making there. Where we are at the moment, I think should be obvious to everyone. The appeal decision has been handed down, and there were, I understand, a lot of interest from all stakeholders in what that decision may entail. And the decision and the instructive reasons that come with it set a clear pathway forward for all of us. After today's briefing, we will publish the guideline for an interim period that allows for feedback on that guideline, but is published for use, given that the law is now clarified through the appeal decision and the regulations stand. There will be minor changes to reflected in other documents that NOPSEMA has already published, and we will update, and they will be available on Monday. And these are things like environment plan assessment policies and decision-making guidelines. However, they don't, you don't need to wait to see what they say. The principles are already embodied in the guideline that will be published and available after the briefing. And I'll touch on the key elements of those here today. What needs to follow, and this is the point again about consultation with those that have expectations around how that consultation should be conducted within the community, is 3 clear steps that need to follow that embody the work to consult broadly. Firstly, title holders, and I expect are already doing this work, to develop consultation processes in consultation with those that could be relevant persons that are to be consulted. And that consultation should inform and give confidence to title holders about the aspects of the consultation that would otherwise give concern, including sufficient information, appropriate timeframes, and these provisions, which there's been a fair degree of questions already from industry, and I know concerns raised in other quarters about the uncertainty that remains in that area. The title holders have the responsibility clearly under the regulations and reinforced through the appeal decision to establish those processes and resolve the uncertainty about what would justify and demonstrate sufficient timeframes, sufficient information and reasonable period. Clearly, after the consultation processes have been developed, the actual job of consultation needs to be carried out, the 4th point there. And then importantly, and it's a point that we've been discussing quite a lot in the previous months, particularly with a lot of stakeholders that would get consulted as relevant persons. And that's that the 2 steps above all occur before NOPSEMA's regulatory oversight. They're like, if you like, a precondition. One thing I want to emphasise here is that consultation must be carried out and completed before submitting an environment plan to NOPSEMA for assessment. We do have other complementary work that will continue in parallel. It's not just about issuing a guideline, and I'll touch on those later in the presentation. But first, I think it's important to go to some of the points about the guideline and how it seeks to support the clarification through the appeal decision and the regulations already. And it's going to be a point laboured quite a lot, not to say that there's not uncertainty about this or that people have a different view, but the duty to consult with relevant persons in the regulations and affirmed through the appeal decision is placed on the title holder through the regulations. And that consultation must include consultation with a particular category that you'd all be familiar with people or organisations whose functions, activities, interests may be affected by the activity. The guideline emphasises there's a broad capture of ascertainable persons or organisations. There's a lot of detail on that point in the appeal decision, and that consultation must be undertaken in course of the preparation of the EP to emphasise that. And then importantly, to underscore the need for this to be recognised as a piece of work that is case specific, is that the consultation needs to be informed by the specific context that consultation is being carried out, the environment plan and the ensuing environment that exists within that environment plan and the petroleum activities and the environmental impacts and risks. It's a question often asked. It doesn't arise directly from the duty to consult under 11A, but we do accept, and the regulations recognise, and as did the court, the consultation isn't just a one-stage affair that's done once an environment plan is submitted and then subsequently accepted. The regulations recognise, and there is a following requirement for title holders to implement the plans they develop, and we accept for the ongoing consultation throughout the life of the activity. We don't talk much about Reg 14.9 today and are focusing instead on the 11A duty and our decision making. Next, we'll cover some specific things. The guideline talks quite a lot about the key elements and details that are clarified through the appeal decision. And this is separated out quite clearly. There's a bit of reordering of information in the way that the court identified these things, and the guideline references back to the relevant paragraphs from the appeal decision to assist in providing more detail and background than we're obviously able to cover in a guideline. That covers topics such as the identification of relevant persons and the care and rigour that needs to be done with, how consultation needs to be carried out, and in particular, the reporting on consultation, where the decision-making of NOPSEMA, as the appeal decision emphasised, is based on the evidence provided in the environment plan, and it's vital that the information that comes through the broad and detailed consultation is part of the environment plan that's submitted to NOPSEMA. There's important clarifications that assist in providing a workable pathway. These are elaborated on in the guideline and drawn out. Such as where interests may be communally held by individuals of a class of relevant persons or groups within a class of relevant persons. Specifically related, but also diving down into some of the details around First Nation peoples and groups, and also that emphasising the need to ensure that advice about how a First Nations group should be consulted and the basis for that consultation, given that interests may be held communally. I think I've covered the last point pretty well, but for emphasis, and I think title holders in the history of NOPSEMA's assessment of environment plans would be able to report the experience that unless the environment plan itself demonstrates the evidence that adequate processes and consultation were used, then we're either requesting further information or providing an opportunity to modify and resubmit as the regulations require us to, should the consultation not have been carried out. And I gather everyone would have read, particularly this part of the judgment, the appeal decision, the specific definitions that have been clarified and were previously subject to interpretation through reading of the regulations. That is the definitions of functions, definitions of interests, and the definition of activities. And for emphasis here, to avoid doubt, there's an important aspect to the appeal decision that applies to all environment plans, as do the definitions, and that a traditional owner's connection to sea country is recognised as an interest that must be considered by title holders where it's determined to be relevant meaning in the context of the environment and the environmental impacts and risks for that particular activity. Recognise the court appeal decision recognises that native title rights may be relevant, but in addition, the appeal decision does recognise sea country connection as an interest on its own. This is a topic, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of sufficient information and reasonable period. There are elements of the regulations which are not detailed in a great degree in terms of the state of satisfaction to be reached in the appeal decision, but it does provide clarity that it's on the title holder to develop processes with input from relevant persons to ensure they have confidence on the method for consultation, the information and material that relevant persons would need, and therefore informed also the amount of time it would take them. The important thing here is that consultation needs to be informed by the information that's provided and is relevant for the activity. There is a challenge, of course, in identifying what information may be useful and necessary to inform that consultation. But to think about it, the responses and outcomes from consultation are only going to be informed by the information that's provided by title holders. And therefore, spending time with relevant persons and carefully considering their expectations on information needs and also their processes that may exist either formally or informally through the periods they may need to consider that information to provide a response. Important thing to elaborate on here and why the bullet points there set out what's important to consider when and the appeal decision provides details on this regarding the practices of consultation. And that's going back to the purpose of consultation, which is to ensure that the title holder in its preparing its environment plan and finalising it for submission to NOPSEMA has the input of relevant persons to ensure that the environmental impacts and risks and how they're managed are properly covered with relevant person input. And to emphasise again, I think I've said this a couple of times already, but the environment plan therefore must clearly demonstrate to NOPSEMA and be able to demonstrate by evidence and objective review that a reasonable opportunity has been afforded. There is information in the appeal decision, and we reference it in the guideline regarding where issues may arise and be considered insufficient information or a timeframe being inappropriate. But the clear message from the appeal decision, and we reference in the guideline, is that the environment plan, the evidence and the explanation about the process and why it's justified as reasonable are what's needed to ensure that any assessment and therefore then decision of NOPSEMA, A, can be seen to objectively meet the criteria for acceptance and also address any legal risk that may be concerned. The message here is full disclosure is essential. I think I didn't mention previously, actually, in the slide there, is another aspect that was identified clearly in the regulations, which we've highlighted in this guideline, is the requirement on title holders to expressly tell relevant persons on the basis of which they could provide information and request that remain confidential. And we also support and obviously expect the facts of consultation, the purpose and the reasons for consulting is on the basis that that person or organisation may be a relevant person, assists in ensuring you're able to demonstrate that the consultation was informed. Specifically about consultation with First Nations people. Direct input from First Nations people and groups should inform approach to consultation. There's a lot of detail in the appeal decision using the Tiwi Islands as an example, and it shouldn't be confused that this means that it's only an issue that's relevant for the Tiwi Islands in terms of how to view First Nations groups that sit behind, may be represented by representative bodies such as prescribed body corporates and native title organisations. And there may be pathways to those groups through representative bodies, but each case is going to be different. And so direct input should be used to inform that rather than making assumptions or not preparing and gathering evidence that demonstrates why it's justified to consult with the class where there's community interest held in a way different than maybe is expected by that relevant person category. The appeal decision emphasises, I think you'd say, and we reflect the wording, that there is no shortage of guidance on decisions that relate to consultation processes under the Native Title Act. This isn't to say that this is about Native Title Act and Native Title rights consultation. They are examples that the judgment seeks to identify and draw attention to, and we do so in the guideline to assist in clarifying and providing pathways that can be adapted to generate workable pathways to ensure consultation with First Nations people and groups. Similar to the other categories of relevant person, the key here is being able to demonstrate that a reasonable opportunity to participate and in accordance with the expectations of relevant persons is provided in evidence in the environment plan or the environment plan sensitive information part. Turning now to NOPSEMA and our task, which only commences, for emphasis, once the environment plan is submitted and been deemed complete after the 5-day completeness check period. That's a presence and absence check for content sufficient to inform an assessment by NOPSEMA. As you're aware, should be aware, the decision-making capacity for NOPSEMA and power is granted under Regulation 10.1a and requires that NOPSEMA be reasonably satisfied that the environment plan demonstrates that it meets the criteria set out in Regulation 10a. And for emphasis here on the slide, you can see that there, and this arises from the appeal decision, that there must be a clear justification by inference within the environment plan for the decision to accept that environment plan, and that it has to be determined objectively. This means that through the assessment process, NOPSEMA may need to make reasonable inquiries of its own to assist itself in evaluating the materials presented in the environment plan and to enable it to inform a view as to whether it should reach the requisite level of satisfaction and that the title holder has discharged the duty to identify and consult with each relevant person. The decision to accept an environment plan is an objective decision on the facts and evidence before the decision maker and is not a subjective judgment, for example, on what could be imagined to be the case. This point reinforces the need for title holders to provide all the details about the consultation and reporting on the outcomes as the regulations have identified. Selective presentation of information will not assist in ensuring appropriate consultation processes have been followed and implemented and achieved, and will erode any otherwise robust outcome in terms of the standing of a decision. I mentioned earlier on other work streams, and it's not a guideline. We are working with other government agencies, both at the Commonwealth level and other jurisdictions. We aren't the only area of government looking at improving and elevating the degree to which, for example, First Nations groups and people are informing decisions made by government and the planning undertaken by proponents for resource development. The recently released government response to the Samuels Review under the headings of the new EPBC Act reform are an example of these, as well as the related cultural heritage protection reforms. Direct engagement with stakeholders in the community has always been a part of our program, and we're expanding that to ensure that we are providing advice to communities on the consultation requirements so they understand them and their rights and their role in the process, and also to hear directly from community about their experience to assist us informing how we advise other parts of the community. Internally, we are working on building on our existing capacity, so the amount of people doing the work and also the expertise in ensuring we're able to continue to provide rigorous independent assessment and decision-making on the evidence submitted in environment plans. We do that through both staff numbers being recruited, and you'll see advertisements related to those in addition to those that we've already undertaken, but we also engage experts on a consultancy ad hoc basis to ensure that the specific circumstances that we see in environment plans can be independently assessed by ourselves. Also, I'd like to mention, of course, that NOPSEMA plans to continue its reconciliation journey. We've rounded out our first year of our reconciliation action plan and the process of progressing to the next. We've also been working hard both on relevant persons consultation improvement since before, but particularly from 2015-16 during the Transparency Task Force that involved a lot of people in this room, as well as the department and stakeholders to the industry. And we're continuing to expand on that work. Similarly, we've been working on improving First Nations engagement and have spent a fair bit of time both internal capacity building, but also in outreach to support First Nations groups. In terms of next steps, the starting slide, and we'll turn to those points before we wrap up. Clearly here, there's some work for industry to ensure that they're developing processes for that identification of relevant persons in accordance with the requirements, and the guidelines will reinforce and reflect those requirements, including the appeal decision. In particular here, we've emphasised and we've adopted the term co-design. It might be new to some people. It's apparently fairly familiar to those in the onshore resources sector. But that's, I guess, shorthand for ensuring that the input from those that are consulted through the processes, such as relevant person consultation, are considered when you're designing and developing your own processes. It's not a task that's done in the weeks and months ahead. I think everybody needs to recognise, and the regulations embody a continuous improvement principle. And that means everyone would naturally expect that processes, while they might be well designed in intention, through their implementation, we'd expect that there's an adaptation to processes to address any issues raised by relevant persons, such as burden or gaps in information or pressures on time frame that they may experience. And that's to ensure that the process remains effective and effective against that objective of ensuring that their input is successful in making its way to improve the environmental risk and impact management tasks that we have collectively. We recognise that there are challenges, but also opportunities in moving forward from this point. Solutions lie in working collaboratively and co-designing consultation frameworks that industry, under the regulations and through the appeal decision, are highlighted as having the responsibility to do. This is important work, not just because of the goal in terms of the inputs from consultation informing impact and management. We recognise we have an ongoing task and need to perform our role as regulator in assessing, making decisions under the regulations, and we will continue to do that. It does mean that time and effort is required by title holders. We're here to provide advice and input to the extent we're able to in the design of your processes, and to ensure that the guidelines are clearly communicated and tested with industry. But there are opportunities here to build on engagement and to improve the relationship and trust with the community, both for industry's benefit, but also the government and NOPSEMA's. In summary, at the end, I'd like to emphasise, of course, the appeal decision has provided clarity in large parts that were otherwise subject to interpretation. We have prepared guidelines in fairly short order to assist in communicating the regulations in the context of the appeal decision. The other documents will be available from Monday. In our normal practice, we always invite feedback, and we have an interim period of 3 months in which clarifications naturally may well be raised on how we've constructed the guidelines, and there will be a consultation hub process for providing those to us. After that period, we'll consider and include any updates in a new version. The remaining tasks in terms of what's next lie ahead for title holders to develop consultation processes, again, in consultation with relevant persons who would expect to be consulted through that process, implementing them, and then submitting EPs for assessment. I really want to end though on something I've said a couple of times during the presentation. The most important thing here is to end back where we started. The purpose of consultation, to inform the management environmental impacts and risks. We can all get lost in some of the detail and complexity in the way issues may arise through the consultation process. Staying focused on the management of environmental impacts and risks in that goal, and bearing in mind that environment in our framework includes social, economic, and cultural features. Robust, genuine, and broad consultation by title holders does involve substantial but necessary work. We recognise the importance to support decision-making and progress of activities, but we need to bear in mind and work to ensure there are benefits for everyone. Better environmental impact and risk management, more informed and engaged communities, and improved trust and relationships between industry, community, and government. Thank you. And the exciting bit, Q&A. Are you going to stand here?
Yeah, I'll stand up here. Okay, we've got quite a few questions have come through. We won't have time to cover all of them today. So we will work towards putting together a Q&A document to answer any residual questions that we haven't been able to address today. Just before I go into asking the questions to Cam and Catherine, there are still a few questions about why we haven't undertaken any consultation in developing the guideline. I think Cam did address that earlier, but I'll just repeat again. The guideline really just reflects what's in the judgment and the state of the law. So it wasn't really something that we required consultation on. So I won't re-ask that question. So for Cameron, what's NOPSEMA's expectations for identifying traditional owners to consult on sea country where there is no native title claim or determination?
I think I covered it with a bit of bolder text in the presentation, but the appeal decision clearly identifies that interests aren't limited to a legal variety, such as native title rights. And so therefore interests need to be read more broadly and could arise from traditional cultural values, for example, the connection to sea country. And so in terms of reaching those groups, there's guidance in the guideline that arises from the appeal decision that clarifies a workable pathway, which otherwise seen, I guess, in numerous extensive numbers of individuals that may well hold those interests and that they may be communally held. And there is a pointer back to the Native Title Act, for example, in consultation processes that could be adopted, but it's not for the purpose of pursuing native title rights resolutions. It's to engage with interests where they're communally held. Sorry, engage with people or groups where the interests are communally held.
Thank you. Catherine, one for you. I think there's probably lots of people with this question. Can any regulatory reform be expected? For example, Reg 11A, definition of relevant persons, to be more specific or targeted?
Thanks, Nicola. So I guess everyone, as Cam mentioned, there are some other reforms underway, particularly the EPBC Act reforms that the government's committed to. So we don't want to preempt those with any changes to our regulations. There will be the development of the national standard on community consultation, including First Nations people through that implementation of the Samuel Review. And so obviously we're continuing to engage, as well as NOPSEMA, with the Department of Environment to make sure that we don't create any conflicts or additional difficulties. There will be, next steps when we do a full review of the environment policy under the OPGGS, that will then look at whether further changes are needed.
Thanks, Catherine. Cameron, ethnographical surveys are different to environmental surveys, which NOPSEMA are well versed in assessing. How will NOPSEMA build capacity in this area?
Well, I think more than just ethnographic surveys, I think cultural features that are tangible or intangible are certainly unique in terms of the methods and how they might need to be reported on. As part of the improvement plan we have in place, we are looking at internal capacity and also processes to ensure the handling of that information. Issues such as gender restricted evidence may arise. We've been putting those in place. We've already, through our contracting panel arrangements, have access to capacity and expertise that understand cultural heritage values and other cultural features of the environment. And we'll continue to build on that. There are existing staff members that have some experience in that area. We're doing both training, but also new recruiting to assist us in ensuring we have the necessary expertise available to support our assessments. And through that, we certainly have, I guess, confidence that we can achieve that and meet any workload needs that arise from any new issues that need to be covered during an assessment, because we've done that multiple times in the past, whether it be increasing our oversight and consideration of greenhouse and climate change impacts or acoustic impacts from impacts on marine mammals and other species.
Thank you. Is the burden from multiple title holder consultation on traditional owner groups recognised, noting they may not have the capacity or willingness to participate?
You have to be not present in the world if you didn't recognise that seeking to consult with someone requires some work on your part and their part. So I think everyone would say you recognise there's effort involved. We hear that there is an expectation, a desire and a need from communities to be asked to provide that input. I think it's something that title holders should consider carefully and consider how they meet both theirs and those to be consulted needs in the way they conduct it to ensure there's unnecessary burden avoided. I think that would be something that if we're aware of should be a concern for everyone. The consultation requirement isn't to force somebody to expend huge amounts of effort and endless time. Importantly, though, it's an offer of an opportunity to provide input that's informed based on information that's shared. And when organisations take up that offer and respond and engage, the consultation requirements are very clear that those issues need to be taken into account and responses provided and so on. We have heard not just from First Nations groups, but other organisations, of course, whose primary role is not to support any other particular industry in their efforts to conduct their activities. And it's a matter between title holders or the industry collectively and those groups to try and resolve how everybody gets something out that they need out of the consultation process in order for the title holders to be able to proceed.
Thanks, Cam. As an impacted stakeholder, can I refuse to consult if I do not approve of the proposal? Will this slow down an approval? Well, I think it's fairly obvious to say there's nothing in the regulations or the appeal decision that clarifies the title holder must elicit a response at all costs. And so I think we have to respect that some people may wish to not respond or to object actively. Both of those things are information that the title holder needs to ensure is in that pack of evidence that we talked about in the briefing and in the guideline to demonstrate they've discharged the obligation to consult. It's not an obligation to get everyone to agree, I think, put simply. But if you're not sharing information sufficient to inform them, there is a risk that no response or refusing to engage could look the same as not informed consultation, which doesn't meet the requirements. Thank you. Will NOPSEMA undertake an assessment of who the relevant stakeholders are during their assessment process, or will NOPSEMA remain reliant on the proponent?
I think I'll touch on this point briefly in the assessment, but to elaborate the decision and the objective state of satisfaction that the regulator must achieve is reliant on the environment plan and the way that the regulation 10 is constructed. But as highlighted in the appeal decision, that the regulator may need to make its own inquiries, and that the process and the policy guidance that we have identifies that already, that we do rely on the environment plan. There are several routes in which our assessment, if it identifies gaps or shortcomings to achieve, to gather more information. More often than not, that's through requests for further information or providing a reasonable opportunity to modify and resubmit to the title holder. But it does, in our assessment policy under admin law, there is capacity for us to decide that on our call that we seek information directly ourselves. And we've done that many times throughout at least my time at NOPSEMA, and under the decision making that we have going forward, the appeal decision identifies that's something that the regulator may need to do.
Thank you. Does NOPSEMA recognise traditional owner groups may not be willing to divulge or share their cultural knowledge through consultation or with government?
Well, certainly we're already aware through our direct engagement through representative groups and individuals, in fact, that they do identify they have information that they are working through how they are able to find a way to provide it to ensure it can be taken into account in decision making, but that there are reservations on providing it through the title holder. We've been working with agencies both in the state and the Commonwealth level to ensure we're, I guess, adopting up-to-date practices and policies to allow the direct collection of evidence. Those processes do, of course, need to recognise that if that information is being used to inform a decision, and that decision obviously affects a title holder in terms of its nature, that we do have an obligation through procedural fairness principles under admin law to provide an opportunity for the title holder to see that information in a way that we are using it. That does present challenges, and that means there may be time frame issues. But we've also made it clear to people raising that issue that if there isn't a way that we can agree through reasonable efforts to find that information, we're going to have to proceed with decision making. And so far, that hasn't presented issues in people being willing to cooperate to find a pathway on that issue.
Thank you. Catherine, this might be one for you. Given how broad relevant persons consultation now is there likely to be any changes to public comment?
Thanks. As Cam's sort of covered, the judgment does clarify the requirements for relevant person consultation. The public comment period on EPs obviously came out of our 2016 review of the consultation transparency requirements in the regulations. I mean, there's no change proposed to that step. That's an additional step following consultation, because the consultation, as described in the regs, is the two-way in-depth consultation that elicits information to inform the development of the EP. The public comment period is a comment period to allow people who've been consulted to see how their comments have been reflected in the EP, but then also for additional people to provide comments. So people who are that don't fall within that category of relevant persons to then provide comments on how the environment management is described in the EP.
Thanks, Catherine. I'll do a couple more before we wrap up around midday. The Slido app will be open for another hour, so people are more than welcome to go away if you think of some more questions as you leave. And as I said, we'll attempt to answer as many of those as we can in a Q&A document. Cameron, noting the urgency of decommissioning efforts, are the same consultation rules set to be applicable, and will the regulator look to fast-track EP approvals?
It's a good question, because as I was sitting here, I did think of something that we didn't mention, but I thought might be obvious, that the regulations regarding consultation apply to all environment plans, and also to proposed revisions to environment plans. I didn't mention that, and doesn't make a distinction between the activity type. There is a distinction for public comment between different types of environment plan, but not for consultation. Consultation is tailored and context specific, so I'd say that. So no, the consultation might not look the same for a decommissioning stage activity as it might for an operations stage, or an exploration well, or a sensitive environment, and so on. You can make an endless list of things that may vary the specific process, and then what that consultation with relevant persons would entail. I think regardless of the activity type, there is an urgent need to ensure that there are processes that have had the input for relevant persons, and that they're implemented, and there are genuine and robust efforts to consult and ensure that inputs from relevant persons make their way and inform how impacts and risks are managed. And so I think that would press upon everyone at every stage of activity that point. We have obviously an interest in ensuring timely progress of decommissioning for other provisions under the legislation. We have to all work together to make sure they all can be complied with and met. And we're already working with title holders that fit that category of needing, through either enforcement or their own planning, to progress decommissioning given the stage of the activity. And we'll continue to work to support them to make sure there can be timely consultation that's robust, genuine, making submissions and have timely decisions.
Okay. Two more that I'll ask here now, and we'll defer the rest for the Q&A. What checks and criteria will NOPSEMA have in place to evaluate whether proponent consultation with relevant persons has been genuine and two-way engagement?
So the criteria, if you like, are pretty clear in the regulations, and the appeal decision highlights these. We will consider all the information in the environment plan to inform the assessment of consultation with relevant persons. So what it doesn't look like is someone opening up the chapter on consultation and reading it and seeing if it looks good. That is not an assessment of relevant person consultation to determine whether the obligation has been properly discharged by the title holder. We will do that assessment in light of all of the content of the environment plan. So the environment values, sensitivities, and the environmental impacts and risks. And so if you like, it's like a parallel assessment, repeat assessment of the evaluation of impacts and risks, but in light of whether the relevant persons that should have arisen did. We do make our own searches through other information. The environment plan assessment policy identifies the sources of information we look at to make checks. And that isn't just about, the example I probably would use would be EPBC database searches or FishCube for fisheries. We look at those information sources certainly to obviously inform whether the description of the environment or the description of the evaluation of impacts and risks is appropriate. But we also look at them as part of the checking to see whether they're all the correct processes. The process was adequate to identify relevant persons in the first place, and that there was a capture. And if there are gaps, we will raise those as issues through the assessment process, either through further information or providing a reasonable opportunity to modify and resubmit. I guess at that stage, it's important to highlight that we aren't aware as the regulator, not having been through and present in all of the consultation, whether the consultation wasn't carried out or not. It may be that evidence wasn't provided in the environment plan. And so we don't prejudge which state the issue is in and put it back to the title holder to clarify that. You know, so it's a fairly lengthy and time-consuming process in the assessment to consider relevant person consultation, because it is not done and not doable in isolation on that topic alone.
Thanks, Cam. And last one, I'm just going to paraphrase because a few people have asked something very similar. So, Catherine, I think this one's probably for you. To what extent will these requirements apply outside of Australia's jurisdiction? So for relevant persons who might be in international jurisdictions?
Very interesting question. I mean, the OPGGS, sorry, the Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Storage Act applies to activities within Commonwealth waters. I'm not sure if the question's looking at stakeholders or people that may have interests outside of Australia. Is that?
Yeah, that's what the questions are asking.
Well, I think that'll be for the title holder to identify whether those people and interests are relevant, and then to demonstrate that to NOPSEMA in their EP. I mean, it's if the input that they're seeking informs the development of the EP, then that's a matter for the process to determine.
There's probably several layers of jurisdiction on that question, and so I think that's one which we might follow up in the Q&A document and produce post, because there's probably a lot of interest in that, and there are a few layers of jurisdiction question in that. So let's take that one as part of the probably long list of other Q&As you've got on your pack.
Yeah, you certainly clarify, particularly once we can see what the questions are sort of getting at. If there are numbers, sort of a number of similar questions, and try and address that more specifically in the written Q&A.
Okay, well, thank you both for participating in the Q&A session, and Cameron for your presentation. So as I said, that Slido will remain open for another hour, so you can continue to put questions on there. Alternatively, there's always our communications mailbox at NOPSEMA that you're welcome to email through any additional questions at any time. And thank you again all for coming today.
Thanks.